Hi, I'm Candace Southall. I'm so excited to be here with you today on this segment for Advanced Strategies and Behavior Change. Today we're going to be talking about Functional Communication Training, or FCT. This is a differential reinforcement procedure in which an individual is taught an alternative response that results in the same class of reinforcement identified as maintaining that interfering behavior. And then interfering behaviors are typically put on extinction, which means that they are no longer reinforced. Now, functional communication training is a little bit different from other differential reinforcement procedures in that that alternative behavior is a recognizable form of communication. It could be a vocalization, a manual sign, or even a picture symbol. So let's find out more. Let me tell you Mark's story from Dunlap and Duda, 2004. Mark, a 3-year-old boy, is a bright and energetic boy. He enjoys participating in activities that involve numbers and letters, reading picture books, and playing with blocks, cars, and trucks. Mark's communication skills, however, have been slow to develop. After many attempts to encourage him to speak more in class, Mark's teacher, Mr. Blake, and his peers have nearly given up. An additional concern has been an increase in episodes of disruptive behavior. When Mark doesn't get a toy that he wants, or when he is asked to share a toy with others, he tends to scream, cry, tantrum, or bite other children. When these behaviors happen, Mark's peers get upset and run away with him, and Miss Blake takes away his toy. This outcome often makes Mark's tantrums worse. However, Miss Blake has noticed that when Mark gets the toy that he wants or is allowed to play alone, he does not exhibit these kind of behaviors. Miss Blake has also noticed that Mark's tantrums occur at times when he is asked to do something that is hard for him. What is functional communication training? Well, as I previously mentioned, it's a differential reinforcement procedure. The student is taught an alternative response, specifically a recognizable form of communication, that results in the same class of reinforcement identified as maintaining the interfering behavior. And then the interfering behavior is placed on extinction. Research has shown effectiveness of FCT implementation with participants most often engaged in aggression, self-injury, or motor and vocal disruptions. However, FCT evaluations have also included bizarre vocalizations, stereotypy, inappropriate sexual behavior, self-restraint, and inappropriate communicative behaviors. Let's get back to Mark's story. Miss Blake and Mark's parents were very concerned about Mark's behavior at school. They discussed the problem at length. Miss Blake said, "We'll need to conduct a functional behavior assessment to learn the function of Mark's behavior. In other words, we will be trying to figure out what Mark is trying to tell us." She continued by saying, "I'll gather some information, observe Mark at different times of the day, and ask you some questions. Then we can use that information to better understand why Mark is having so much difficulty playing with his friends." Mark's father agreed that it would be a good idea and added, "We really need to know exactly why Mark is doing this." FCT interventions progress through 3 stages. A functional assessment or even a functional analysis is conducted to identify the environmental events that serve as reinforcers for the interfering behavior and the conditions that evoke that problem behavior. Those are the relevant establishing operations that increase the value of the reinforcer. A socially acceptable communicative response is strengthened by reassigning the reinforcer found to maintain the interfering behavior to that communicative response. With that said, remember, you need to consider the social recognition of the response. This will more likely make that behavior reinforced. Often, a vocalization, a picture symbol, are easily recognized. Signs can be easily recognized to people that are familiar. You should also consider the response effort. Remember, we learned with the matching law, the more effort that we're requiring in the response, the more reinforcement for the response that will be required. And finally, the FCT treatment is extended across settings and caregivers. Remember to always teach to generalization. After several observations, Miss Blake found that when Mark was required to share a preferred toy, he was unable to communicate his frustration. Instead, Mark communicated his frustration through tantrums and biting. Miss Blake also found that Mark's tantrum were more severe when he was not given a prompt or an advance warning that he would need to share the toy or play with something different. Miss Blake and Mark's parents then met to discuss his strengths and communication skills. They agreed that Mark's verbal communication was slow in developing, so at first, an efficient form of communication should probably involve something visual, such as a cue card, to support his speech. Although everybody wanted to encourage Mark's speech, they decided to take advantage of his interest in the alphabet and early reading. Therefore, the initial replacement skill would be a cue card that Mark could hold up to indicate his request for assistance in obtaining a toy or completing a difficult activity. At the same time, Mark would be encouraged to use speech for the same purpose. So now that we have discussed selecting the new communication form or replacement behavior, we must put the interfering behavior under extinction. In other words, we must block all reinforcement for the previous interfering behavior and prompt the new behavior. We want to block the interfering behavior and we want to prompt the new behavior. FCT without extinction will frequently fail to result in sufficient reductions in that interfering behavior. Interfering behavior may need to be reinforced during FCT when there is little control over the reinforcer. You might be thinking of peer attention in a classroom, or when withholding the reinforcer may be dangerous if you're working with a large adult who engages in severe aggression or self-injury. Anyway, the effectiveness of this treatment approach will rely on the communicative response competing with that interfering behavior. There are only a few reported cases that FCT can be effective without extinction, but those that do show that success, it suggests that a longer duration of reinforcement will be required. And then we want to make sure we conduct training during naturally occurring routines because that will promote generalization of those conditions. However, this natural establishing operation only approach in isolation is likely to result in relatively slower acquisition of the target response due to fewer learning opportunities. And in some cases, it might be dangerous for severe behaviors. Contriving teachable opportunities can accelerate learning by arranging for multiple opportunities to prompt and reinforce the new communicative response, both of which can be repeatedly arranged to occur under presumably safer conditions. So ideally, we'll have multiple opportunities, and that could initially require contriving teachable opportunities and creating your own establishing operations. All right, regardless, there must be many opportunities for the child to receive reinforcement for the newly acquired communication form. So for Mark, after a week of practice, Miss Blake saw that Mark was getting better at leaving preferred toys and activities and being able to communicate with his peers by using the cue cards. Miss Blake was not only pleased with Mark's comments, but also with how the other children accepted Mark. They had begun to include him in their playtime activities, which appeared to make Mark very happy. Although it took more time for Mark to respond without having a tantrum, Mark learned to share with his peers. He stopped having tantrums and biting his peers, and instead used the cue cards and some speech to communicate. Mark had learned a new and more functional skill, and his peers soon stopped avoiding him. Building on his progress, Ms. Blake continued to use FCT and Mark's preferences to encourage him to use speech more frequently and for more complex purposes. So, when the reinforcer and communicative response have been identified, the teaching setting and the individual who will teach the communicative response should be selected. Both decisions are essentially issues of stimulus control and generalization. The ultimate success of FCT is determined by the extent to which communication occurs in the presence of all relevant caregivers in all relevant settings. That does not necessarily mean that all relevant caregivers should simultaneously implement FCT in all relevant settings. There are important starting conditions to ensure acquisition of the communicative response, but eventually the teaching conditions are modified to promote generalization and maintenance of treatment effects.